Welcome to Indoor Planting, brought to you by the Tau Rho Omega chapter of Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority. I am Brandon Greenhouse, and I'll just be guiding you through some tips and tricks for beginners getting into indoor planting, some general care tips, soils, amendments, propagations, humidity, things like that. I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about indoor plant growing, and I have quite a few actually plants in front of me today that I'm going to share with you. These are all plants that I grow indoors. Obviously, I'm in Chicago, so some of my conditions are going to be different than yours. These are all common plants, though. I'll also warn you that I have two cats that may or may not be making cameo appearances. Let's hope not, but you never know around here. So I'm just going to start by going into it. So I have lots of plants here, some tropical. I usually keep a humidifier going just to keep the humidity around 60-70% because they really like humidity. It's actually quite humid in Chicago anyway, and we live kind of close to the beach, so humidity isn't really an issue here, but it's always nice to have that extra humidity sort of flowing through because especially when you're dealing with tropical plants, they really thrive in those conditions. The plants I'm going to discuss with you today, though, these are plants that are fairly easy to care for, and most of them, a lot of you are probably going to be like, oh, like either I have one or my grandmother has one, or I've seen one at my doctor's office, or any number of things like that. But these are great plants to have in the house, and they don't need a lot of attention. These are the kind of plants that you do see in like doctor's offices, and maybe even a coworker has it at their desk. But I'm going to go through them with you, and then I'll just talk about my general care tips, and then I'll talk to you a little bit about plant propagation, which is basically making more plants from the plant that you have, which is really cool and a money saver for sure. So I'm going to go through these with you first, just to sort of give you an idea, and bear with me, I may have to refer to my notes from time to time, but let's get started. So the most common one that you're going to see, I have a bigger one, but in the interest of not crowding the table too much, I picked a smaller one. And this is just sort of your standard golden pothos. It's referred to as devil's ivy. Sometimes you'll see it. You can find these at big box stores, at a Lowe's or at a Home Depot quite easily, Menards, those types of places. And this one is probably like the sort of go-to for a person who's sort of getting into plants. I mean, these are really going to be tips for growing plants indoors, but most of these can apply to plants being grown outside as well. But most plants, this is going to be a great place to sort of start if you're a novice. This doesn't require a lot of attention. It really doesn't. It's one of those plants that thrives on neglect. So these are wonderful for beginners. So this is this. Basically, you can see it's a really simple plant. And then I have also this one, which is another really easy one to grow. This is another pothos. This is called Marbled Queen, and you can see it's got some really nice modeling on it, more variegation, so to speak. Sometimes it's referred to as a cheesecake pothos as well, but this one's another one really simple to grow, doesn't have a lot of intense requirements, and does pretty well, thrives on neglect as well. And this one is one that has been grown from other cuttings of other marble queens. So yeah, it's a really beautiful plant, and it does really well in a variety of conditions. And then we've got this one here. This is a neon pothos. So as you can see, it's sort of got that like lime green color, so it's a little bit different than the golden or the marble queen that we were just looking at. But once again, thrives on neglect. That's a running theme. But yeah, this one's a great one too. All of these plants, they're sort of in different locations and they're getting varying amounts of light, but they all seem to be doing just fine with the light that they're getting. And then, okay, so we've got those, and then we've got this one. These all also, they're called pothos, but they fall under the genus of Epiprimnum. So this is another one. This also falls under the Epiprimnum family. Like this one, for instance, this is an Epiprimnum aureum. Right here, that golden pothos, the first one I showed you, and then this is a Cebu blue pothos. This one's a little bit less common. You sometimes are going to see these at the growing centers, but they can be a little bit harder to come by. And I'm going to get a little bit closer with that. As you can see, this one has a really nice like bluish green hue to it, and the leaves are more like arrow shaped than some of the leaves that we've been looking at, like the leaves on this on the golden pothos, for instance, a lot of them have more of a almost heart shape in a way, and these are more arrowhead leaves. This one, it's not a finicky one. It grows really well too indoors, and it's another one you can sort of leave alone. But it's a great one to have in the house as well. And then we've got this category. A lot of people place these under the pothos family, but they're actually not. They actually fall under the Scindapsus family. And these are also great plants. They grow very similarly to the pothos, but as you'll see, they look a little bit different. This one is Scindapsus pictus exotica. And this is a big boy. As you can see, once again, it's got like a really nice, almost like mottled variegation in a way similar to that marble queen we were looking at a few moments ago. But this one is a great plant too. Very prolific grower. Doesn't have a lot of intense requirements as far as light is concerned or anything like that. But that one's a great one. And then we've got this one. This one's a little bit smaller. This is also a member of the Scindapsus family. This is a Scindapsus silverian. So I'm going to show you. And you'll see the leaves are a little bit smaller, but you can see it has some of that mottling, which is similar to the Scindapsus pictus exotica that I was just showing you. It's actually a crossbreed, from what I understand, between the Scindapsus pictus exotica that I showed you earlier, and then there's also a Scindapsus pictus argyrius. As you can see, like some of these leaves, like these types of leaves where there's very little mottling, but the base of the leaf is that really great dark green color, and then there's some silver spots. That's going to be a little bit different. But then if you're looking at like this leaf, for instance, you'll see how this leaf is pretty similar to this one that I was showing you earlier. Those are kind of akin to one another. This one is like a crossbreed between this one, and I wish I did have an argyrius just to show you, but the ones that have sort of the base with the darker green and then the silver speckling on them, that's more of what the argyrius looks like. And so this one's a crossbreed between the two. So you're going to find some leaves that have that sort of silvery hue, like these, you know, and then you're going to find some that are the sort of almost like inversion of these, which is the argyrius, which is the dark green background with the silver speckling on top of that. And then there's some of the leaves, like this one, for instance, as you can see. This one's sort of like a cross between the two. There's lots of those. So the silverian is like a crossbreed between the two different types of pothos. Of Scindapsus, but it's another fun, easy grower, and this one does well. The thing that I will say about all of these is that they're really great because they can be grown in a variety of light conditions, and they don't require a lot of attention. I've got some plants that are extremely temperamental. They want to be watered when they want to be watered, and if you wait too long, then you could damage the roots. If you water them too soon, then they can get root rot. And root rot is basically, it's when the roots become almost waterlogged because the plant has been watered so often over a period of time that the roots are no longer able to take in water and use it as nutrients to get it to the leaves, because it's just been watered and watered and watered. And a lot of people, they'll talk about, I haven't had a lot of luck growing a particular plant. And that's the reason why, is because the plant itself has become so full of water in those roots that it's no longer able to get the water to the leaves. One thing that's really cool about these plants, especially the Scindapsus plants, like this one for instance, is that they do a really good job of letting you know when they need to be watered. These leaves, which look pretty good right now because I watered it recently, but what happens is they start to curl in kind of like that, and that's their way of sort of saying, hey, it's time for me to get some water. So I don't really have to check them too often. I just sort of set it and forget it and leave them alone, and they sort of take care of the rest. They let you know, they really do, so you don't really have to worry too much about it. You can always stick your finger in the soil, and if when you stick your finger in the soil about 1 or 2 inches, if that top 1 or 2 inches is dry, then that's a pretty good indication that it's time for the plant to receive a little bit of water. And then also, like when it comes to fertilizers and things like that, just your simple fertilizer. I mean, something that's like 20-20-20. That's going to be fine for like your regular plant. And fertilizers. Look it up really quick just to make sure I have this right. So it's like the NPK, and each of these is a value. The N is for nitrogen, the P is for phosphorus, and then the K is for potassium. So you just really, any simple fertilizer will do. Some soils, you can buy Miracle Grow. I know that works really well. And yeah, so any soil will really do for these plants. Sometimes with some of my specialty plants, I have to go in and I have to make amendments to the soil, which is when you sort of add other things to the soil that you wouldn't find in the soil upon purchasing it. So you may have to add in perlite, for instance. That's an amendment that you can add in. You'll find that at the gardening center. It's those little white balls that you see in soil. They serve several purposes. One of them is that they help to make sure that the soil doesn't become too waterlogged or sort of caked when the soil just sort of is impacted upon itself and it becomes really dense and the water is not traveling through quickly enough, and then that can also lead to the root rot we were talking about earlier. So that's one of the reasons you want to make sure when you're picking out a pot for your plants. I always advise people, more often than not, at least for almost all of my plants, you want to make sure you have a plant that has a drainage hole on the bottom, so that when you're watering it, the water can escape through the bottom. That's going to keep the plants from getting root rot, as easily, because as long as there's a place for the water to leave the plant at the bottom, then that's going to lead to a happier life for your plant. It's going to also ensure that the roots aren't just sitting in water. So yeah, I would advise you to make sure that you have a pot that you have your plant in where the water can escape. If you do have one of those really nice pots, maybe that is like a cashpo type pot that you can sit your plastic container inside of, that's great too. Just make sure that you take your plant out, maybe take it either outside and water it so that the water can drain, or take it to the sink in the kitchen or somewhere like that. And as we were talking about earlier with the amendments, there's perlite, that's great and that's easy to find. Sometimes people will add things like orchid barks or orchid chips to it, and that's just little pieces of bark of wood that can be added to the plant, to the soil, and that also is another means for making sure that oxygen is getting to the roots, but it also helps to make sure that the soil itself isn't becoming impacted, or isn't holding on to water for too long. Any of those amendments, that's one of the main reasons for having them in there, is to make sure that your soil isn't becoming completely full of water. So yeah, so there's many different types of amendments. There's horticultural charcoal. That's one amendment that's really great also for adding to the aeration in the soil, and also that adjusts the pH levels. But that's all stuff you don't really have to worry about, like orchid bark or additional perlite or horticultural charcoal or anything like that, or sand, or any number of other things that you can add. Sand is an amendment that you add sometimes to a potting soil if you're going to be using it for like succulents, like cacti and things like that, because that really does help as well with the drainage, and it helps to dry out that soil because they really don't like to be wet for too long, and root rot can occur a lot easier in those types of plants. That being said, so these are all wonderful plants to have growing in the house, and they can grow, in a wide array of conditions. Some plants get temperamental if they get too much sun or if they don't get enough sun, especially when we're talking about root rot and things like that. If you've got a plant that needs to be getting a certain amount of sunlight and it's not getting that sunlight, then it's essentially not using the water that's in the soil, and it could develop root rot a lot easier than a plant that's getting a more substantial amount of sunlight. So that's just something to consider. And then the other thing that I was going to talk to you about was propagation. So propagation is the process of taking a cutting from a plant and then placing that cutting into, let's say, like a glass of water or something. And you can also take propagation cuttings and you can place them directly into soil. A lot of people will do that. You'll end up with a plant maybe like this first one that I showed you, something like this. And you may be thinking to yourself, this is small, or it's growing in a certain way. It's growing and it's just sort of vining. This is essentially, as you can see, it's one sort of vine. You know, and maybe you're thinking maybe a couple more leaves grow on this, and then you think to yourself, it's just one long vine. I don't like that. I want it to not look like that anymore. I want it to be a little bit bushier. I want there to be a little bit more substantial, you know, rooting happening in here. So the thing to do would be, there are these nodes on these plants, okay? You can see, let me see, right here, like right there. And if you've got one of these at home, you can spot them, this. You would want to take a snipping right here. You'd want to take one right below. That's what you want to do from here. And then you could take this portion. There's one right here. There's another one right there, as you can see. You could essentially do two different cuttings right there. You could take one right below this one, and then you could take another one right below here. So make sure that these nodes are making contact with either the soil. If you're just going to take the node cuttings and stick them back in here and then water it, that's fine too. Or if you want to, you can take those node cuttings and then you can place these into a glass of water. And after about, I don't know, maybe like a week or 2 weeks, maybe a little bit longer, you're going to start to see roots developing. And those roots are sort of coming from that contact that it's been making with the water. And they can be in a position where it's getting lots of sun. It can be a position where it's getting a little bit less sun. It just may take a little bit longer. You don't want to place them in direct sun, you know? And the other thing that I want to mention is direct sun, like the most powerful sun that you can give to a plant is southern exposure. So if you've got a plant and it's placed in a southern facing window, that's a lot of light. And it's doable for some plants, mainly for those succulents that I was talking about earlier who really thrive from that type of sunlight. It could be a lot though for some plants. I would advise, even with these, even though they are as hardy as they are and they do as well as they do, I would advise, if you're going to have them near a southern window, I would say not having them in like a southern facing window sill. Eastern light is really like the gold standard when it comes to majority of plants. They love it. It's that morning light that's really wonderful for them. Western light's okay. Western light is second to southern exposure in terms of like just hot direct exposure for a plant, because all of that evening sun is really what's going to hit it. And that can be a lot sometimes depending on the plant. These plants would do fine on a western windowsill. They do fine. Northern is the least amount of light. They'd be fine there. I actually have had some of these pothos growing like on the other side of the room, almost in like a corner. So I'd say probably like 10, 15 feet away from a southern exposed window, and those grow fine. They don't grow a lot. It's not going to be a prolific grower for you, but it's going to do the trick. So there's lots of ways in which these plants can grow. And they're also the kind of plants that when you go on vacation, if you're going to be gone for a week or two, they'll be fine. Water them before you leave and they'll be completely fine. They are really no fuss. And as I said earlier with the propagation, you take those cuttings like I was talking about, and then you leave them be. And I'm going to show you an example of a propagation. I have a plant over here. It's a philodendron, which is a completely different breed of plant that I'm not really going to get into, but I will show you what the cuttings look like after having been snipped off. They were done in the exact same way, right below the nodes, and then they were placed directly into a large vase of water, and then they were left alone for, these have been in there for actually too long, probably I'd say a couple months. That's not good. The water roots have gotten really long, but it'll be fine. But I'm going to show you. Give me one moment. So this is that philodendron Bloody Mary I was just talking to you about. As you can see, these leaves are really great dark black color. The stems are really great maroon. These were essentially taken from a plant that I didn't think was doing too hot, and I just took a bunch of cuttings from it that were salvageable, and I put them in here. So they've just been sort of sitting, I'll show you, in the water. You can kind of see all those roots, and all I did was take these and put them in water. And it doesn't have to be, you know, a container this big. It can be like a small cup will work. Sometimes you can take like a water bottle and just stick them right in the top of the water bottle, fill the water bottle up to make sure that the roots are constantly making contact with that node that we talked about, that part that we want to make sure is submerged in the water or submerged in the soil, make sure that that's making contact with the substrate, the soil substrate, or with the glass of water, because that's how roots are going to come about. But you do that, and then these can be taken out of here and placed directly into soil, and they'll grow just fine, just like regular roots. Sometimes water roots can be a little tricky, like these if you let them get too long, but most of the time they're completely fine, and they'll convert to soil roots once they're taken out of the water. I've done conversions both ways. I placed plants directly into soil, and I placed plants into water. It's kind of fun to place it in water sometimes because you can actually see the process of what's going on, and you're not as sort of curious. Like when you place it into soil, you don't know until you see maybe another shoot popping out of the leaf that you placed in the water. Then you're like, okay, it rooted. But other than that, sometimes you don't have a way of knowing. And they have like rooting hormones as well that you can buy, and those work really well too. They can sometimes aid in the rooting process, but to be completely honest with you, when we're talking about plants like these hardy plants, these really virtually indestructible plants, you don't really need to do anything. They sort of take care of themselves. So you just want to sort of set it and forget it, as I said earlier. Just sort of get them in that soil or get them in that water and leave them be for a while. And then when those roots, if you're going to place them in water, when you leave them alone for about, when they get to about an inch long, it's fine to transfer them. So that's really it. So we covered a lot today. We talked about several different types of pothos. We talked about Scindapsus as well. We talked about the difference between the Scindapsus pictus exotica, Scindapsus pictus argyrius, and the Scindapsus silveriane. We talked about multiple forms of pothos that we have here. We talked about the marble queen. We talked about the neon pothos. We talked about the Cebu blue. And we talked about the gold standard in pothos, the warhorse that is the golden pothos, also known as devil's ivy. Sometimes, as I said, you'll see it as that. We talked about soil amendments. We talked about light conditions. We talked about humidity. We talked about propagation. So I think that you are more than equipped to go out and find yourself pothos. And thanks so much for watching the Tauro Omega Indoor Plant Tips.